Hello students and welcome back to Political Science 1513, American Federal Government. As always, I am your instructor, Connor Alford, and in this video we're going to begin the first part of our two-part series on the executive branch. Today we're starting with the presidency, so we'll talk about what the presidency is and how it's structured as well as what it does. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the president himself. We'll discuss presidential powers, the roles of the modern president, and we'll talk just a little bit about checks and balances. In the next video, we'll move on to talking about the other major component of the executive branch, the executive bureaucracy, which is probably the largest and today arguably the most powerful part of the federal government. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For this video, there are a series of 4 learning objectives that you can focus on as you begin to take notes and move through lecture. The first learning objective asks for you to describe the function and organization of the executive branch as a whole. The second learning objective asks for you to distinguish between and describe the formal and informal powers of the president and explain how these have changed over time. The third learning objective asks for you to discuss the 5 hats worn by the modern president, or in other words, to explain the 5 major roles that presidents tend to fill in our government today. Finally, learning objective number 4 asks for you to explain the various threats to the president's power and the importance of what we call the presidential imperative. All right then, let's go ahead and get started with that first learning objective by getting a sort of bird's eye view of the executive branch as a whole. So remember that under the Constitution, the 3 cardinal functions of government, legislating, adjudicating, and administrating the law, are divided across 3 separate independent organs of federal government. Each of these organs is called a branch. The legislative branch legislates or creates the law, while the judicial branch adjudicates or resolves disputes about how to interpret and apply the law to particular cases or controversies. Well, the executive branch administrates, which is a fancy way of saying that the executive branch is there to execute and enforce the law. Executing the law means carrying it out at the ground level. So if Congress, for instance, creates a new tax, it's the executive branch's job to actually go out and start collecting that revenue from the American people. And if Congress has specified a particular purpose for the revenue generated by this new tax, well, it's the executive branch that makes sure that money goes where it's supposed to go. But in addition to this, it has to enforce the law. And there are really a couple of ways to look at this idea that the executive branch is there to execute and enforce the law. Domestically, enforcing the law means maintaining law and order. So if we've got riots in the street, then yeah, it's the executive branch's job to step in and put an end to those. If we have states or cities or other domestic American actors who here in our own country are refusing to comply with the law, then once again it becomes the executive branch's duty under the Constitution to get involved. So, for instance, under the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the city of Little Rock, Arkansas refused to comply with a federal court ruling which mandated the desegregation of public schools. And what did President Eisenhower do? Well, he signed an executive order dispatching the National Guard to enforce federal law against that domestic dissident. So that's one element of enforcing the law. But it's also worth noting that in order for the president to be able to execute and enforce our laws, in order for the executive branch as a whole to be able to execute and enforce our laws, it's important for us to preserve the sovereignty of our country from foreign aggressors. Because remember, sovereignty is the power to govern day-to-day life in a particular area, to make all of the laws and then to administrate those laws from one moment to the next. And if our country were to be, say, conquered by a foreign power, it's very unlikely that that foreign power would then allow the United States to continue following our Constitution. If this foreign power were China, for example, you can bet your bottom dollar that there would be no religious freedom in our country because there isn't any religious freedom in China. Well, the First Amendment of our United States Constitution, that's a source of law for lawmakers, says that we will have a freedom of religion in this country. Therefore, in order to enforce and execute the law, the executive branch must also maintain national security. protecting us from threats to our safety and sovereignty and independence so that we can continue to administrate our country as we see fit and as is mandated under the United States Constitution. Therefore, it is worth noting that the various arms of the United States Armed Forces are technically a part of the executive branch. So if you have a family member who is currently an active duty service member, well, guess what? That individual is a part of the executive branch. So overall, understand the executive branch is that organ of federal government which is constitutionally charged with the duty of executing and enforcing the laws. However, contrary to what you might have heard in, say, a high school civics course, the executive branch is not synonymous with the term president. While it is true that the president is an important and arguably the most important part of the executive branch, he is still just one cog in a much, much larger and very, very complicated machine. So I want you to understand that the executive branch as a whole is organized into a number of different components, most of which either fall into the category of the presidency or the executive bureaucracy. The presidency is made up of the President of the United States, or POTUS, as well as the Vice President, the Executive Office of the Presidency, or EOP, the White House Office, the Cabinet, and the Kitchen Cabinet. And then we've got the executive bureaucracy, which, as I think I've already mentioned, is the largest and most active organ of federal government. The executive bureaucracy is the machinery of government. It is the body of millions of federal employees who handle the day-to-day bread and butter of administrating our country. For instance, in the executive bureaucracy, you find the IRS, or Internal Revenue Service. These are the federal employees who have been hired to handle the administration of tax policy in our country. So it's their job to make sure that everybody is actually paying their taxes and that those tax dollars are going where they're supposed to. And if Congress were to create a law that, for instance, said we're going to distribute tax dollars to various U.S. households to help stimulate the economy during a quarantine period, well, it would be the IRS responsible for making sure that everybody got their checks. So the executive bureaucracy, again, is a very large and important part of the executive branch, but we're not going to talk about the executive bureaucracy in this video. We're going to save that for later. So let's take a step back and look at the first of the two major components of the executive branch, the presidency. The presidency, as I've mentioned, is made up of not only the president and vice president, but other groups of individuals. By and large, there are two important groups of advisors and two important groups of staffers, or day-to-day workers, within the presidency. On the advisor side of your screen, you'll notice that the first and the only formal and constitutional panel of advisors to the president is what we call the President's Cabinet, or simply the Cabinet. The Cabinet is the formal panel of advisors to the President established under Article 2, Section 2 of the United States Constitution, and comprised of the Vice President, plus the heads of the 15 Cabinet departments and any other individual appointed by the President. The Cabinet's role is to advise the President on any subject that he may require relating to the duties of each member's respective office. Now, to break this down, I need to explain a term that appears in that definition I just provided. So remember what I told you. The Cabinet, the President's Cabinet, is made up of the Vice President plus the heads of the 15 Cabinet departments. Well, remember that I told you that the two major components of the executive branch are the presidency and the executive bureaucracy. Well, in the executive bureaucracy, those millions of federal employees are organized into a hierarchical structure of independent and subsidiary agencies, departments, so on and so forth. The cabinet departments are the 15 largest departments or administrative subdivisions of the executive bureaucracy, and they report directly to the president. Each of these cabinet departments encompasses a large number of subsidiary agencies, and they're going to handle very broad issue areas. So, for instance, one of the 15 cabinet departments that make up the bulk of the executive bureaucracy is the Department of Treasury. The Department of Treasury is headed by the Secretary of Treasury, so the Secretary of Treasury is going to serve on the President's cabinet. The Treasury Department is there to pay all federal bills. It handles borrowing money, collecting federal taxes, minting coins, and printing paper currency, supervising national banks, so on and so forth. So the Treasury Department basically handles all things money, and that's a very broad issue area. So the management of our country's treasury is going to be organized into a series of smaller tasks. As I mentioned, one part of managing the money in our country is dealing with taxes. So within the cabinet department, the Treasury, we have a subsidiary agency that I've already mentioned, the IRS, or Internal Revenue Service. And the Internal Revenue Service is the portion of the Treasury Department which specifically handles taxes. But gathering tax and distributing tax revenue as directed by Congress is only one part of managing our country's money. Another part of managing our country's money is minting coins and printing paper currencies. So in addition to the IRS, the Treasury Department also includes the U.S. Mint, which handles minting coins and printing paper currency. So what we're going to find then is that these 15 departments are very, very large, and they handle a very large number of issue areas. But each one is going to be headed by a secretary, with the single exception of the Department of Justice, which is headed by the Attorney General. These 14 secretaries and the Attorney General are going to serve on the President's cabinet. The Secretary of Treasury is going to advise the President about what's going on with our country's money, while the Secretary of the Department of Education is there to advise the President about educational problems, and the Attorney General is there to advise the President about any issues that relate to, well, justice and legal advice and the enforcement of federal criminal laws. The Secretary of Labor is there to advise the President about labor laws and the interests of workers. The Secretary of Defense is there to manage the armed forces and provide the President with advisement about the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, so on and so forth. So, one thing that is worth noting is that the secretaries and the Attorney General, the heads of these cabinet departments, are technically a part of both the executive bureaucracy and the presidency. And nobody else in our entire government can make the same claim, not even the president or vice president. So the 15 department heads, vice president, and other appointees are formally, legally, there to serve on the president's cabinet, keeping him informed about events and developments, wants, needs, and interests in our country. And they're a very important part of the executive branch because without their advice, the president doesn't have access to information about the problems facing Americans on a day-to-day basis. And he also lacks the expert advice that the cabinet departments can provide. Because while the president might have a background in business or in statescraft, something to that effect, he's very unlikely to be an expert in all things that governments deal with. So, for instance, our current president, Joe Biden, is absolutely not an expert in all things education, and neither was his predecessor, and neither was his predecessor. So they depend upon experts who have professional backgrounds that make them uniquely well qualified to provide advice about how best to solve the problems facing American students on the ground level. Well, if the president were to ignore the advice of his cabinet, ignore their suggestions and recommendations, he'd probably wind up making some really bad decisions, but just as importantly, he would alienate the advisors that he relies upon. And if they feel like he's not taking them seriously, they can create a lot of problems for him by refusing to cooperate, refusing to provide the information he needs, and thereby leaving him in the dark. So the cabinet is a really important part of the federal government because the president is dependent upon the cabinet for the information he needs to be an effective administrator. But in addition to the cabinet, we've got another panel of advisors called the Kitchen Cabinet. And the kitchen cabinet can be thought of as the informal panel of advisors to the president. And basically, every president has kept a kitchen cabinet since at least Andrew Jackson, but these individuals are not necessarily official government employees that receive a paycheck for their service. The kitchen cabinet is purely informal. These are the friends, family members, and close relations that the president pays attention to, simply because he knows and trusts them and their judgment. The kitchen cabinet doesn't have any formal power or authority, but it's still very important in a couple of ways. First, the kitchen cabinet can be very important for policy. As an illustration of this, think back to the presidency of Barack Obama. One of the members of President Obama's kitchen cabinet was his wife, Michelle Obama. Now, you know that Michelle Obama, the First Lady, was not really, by virtue of being married to a president, an elected official with any actual administrative, legislative, or judiciary authority. But she nevertheless had a great deal of influence over the administration of her country because, as a member of the president's kitchen cabinet, as somebody the president respected and listened to, she had Obama's ear. And she was able to use this influence to shape his decision-making. And one way that she was able to shape the administration of policies in our country is something that some of you might have experienced personally. Because Michelle Obama was very concerned about the health and nutritional value of student meals in our country. And so she used her position on the kitchen cabinet to help lead an effort to change the administration of school lunches. Some people thought this was a great thing, some people thought that it was a bad thing, but however you felt about the changes, they were ultimately implemented in large part because of the leadership of somebody who didn't really officially hold any elected office, Michelle Obama. And she was able to have that influence over the administration of policies in our country because she was on the kitchen cabinet. In addition to actually shaping policy through the advice, recommendations, and suggestions that they make to presidents, however, the members of a president's kitchen cabinet can also be important for politics. The fact that they have the president's ear means that they're often subject to scrutiny by political forces and media agents around the country. And again, I'm going to use Barack Obama's presidency as an example of this. When Barack Obama was the president, one of the members of his kitchen cabinet was his reverend and spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeremiah Wright. But before President Barack Obama was in his second term, as he was gearing up to run for re-election, that Reverend Jeremiah Wright happened to make an extremely controversial sermon where he repeatedly shouted "GD America" without the censorship. Now, I'll let you look into the details and form your own opinion, but the fact that he was shouting "GD America" really upset and offended a very large number of people, and it was very concerning to many voters that this was the sort of person that our president at the time paid careful attention to and listened to. And as a result of this, Barack Obama experienced a drop in his popularity in polls among voters right before he's getting ready to run for re-election. So he had to engage in PR, in damage control, and he basically had to distance himself from the Reverend in order to ensure his re-election. Had he not handled that situation well, it very well could have resulted in a different outcome for the 2012 presidential election, and as you might imagine, had Barack Obama not gotten re-elected in 2012, our country would look very different right now. So the kitchen cabinet is not formally a position or set of positions in government, but practically speaking, in the real world, we know that it is an important position and that it does have real-world consequences. Now that we're done talking about the two major groups of advisors within the presidency, let's jump to the right side of your screen and talk about the two major groups of staffers or day-to-day office workers within the presidency. There are two groups of staffers that we need to talk about, and we're going to start with the White House office. The White House office is the personal office of the president, which tends to the president's political needs and manages the media. You can think of the White House office as the president's political team. Their job is not necessarily to look out for what's in the best interest of the country as a whole, but rather to look out for what's in the best interest of the president's political career and agenda. In other words, they're his full-time PR team. his press secretary, his chief of staff, the individuals who are there to make sure that the president's political interests are being satisfied. And this is actually really quite controversial, because what this means is that we basically have a full-time campaign staff paid using tax dollars who are currently in positions of power and whose job it is to help the current president get reelected and achieve his political goals and advance his political agenda. Some people think that this is a problem, because if you're not a fan of the current president, you're still an American citizen who's being forced to pay taxes that are then being used by that president to help pursue goals that you don't like and to help promote his own political career. So this is really quite controversial. But the White House office was created under the presidency of FDR. And the reasoning behind it was that if we had a president who was so busy running for re-election that he couldn't focus on running the country, we would get bad policies. And so to free up the president so that he can spend all of his time and energy focusing on his duties as president and not his responsibilities as a future candidate for re-election, then we would have better administration. I don't know if you find this argument convincing or not, but do understand that's what the White House office serves to function as in our government, and that's why it's controversial. In addition to the White House office, or political team, however, we also have the executive office of the presidency, which you can think of as the administrative team. The executive office of the presidency, or EOP, is made up of several hundred employees. And this, again, is an organization established by FDR to assist the president. But in this case, they are there to assist the president, not in managing his public image, but in carrying out major duties and coordinating with the executive bureaucracy. If you know a little bit about history, or more particularly, if you know a little bit about recent U.S. history, you know that under the presidency of FDR, the size of the American federal government, and in particular of the executive bureaucracy, skyrocketed. It became far and away larger than the framers had ever expected it to become. And as it got larger and more complicated, and as it began to take on new and more complicated duties, it became increasingly difficult for the president to find enough hours in the day to communicate with all of the additional offices that were being created. So FDR worked with Congress to create the executive office of the presidency, and these are the individuals who help the president to coordinate with other actors in government. So if the president were to tell a member of Congress or the Secretary of State, have your people call my people, these are the my people he would be talking about. So those are the two groups of advisors and the two groups of staffers that operate within the presidency. Then, of course, we've got the vice president, who really doesn't have too many formal powers, casts tie-breaking votes in the event of a 50-50 vote in the Senate, and replaces the president in the event that he becomes incapacitated or passes away. So rather than talking too much about the vice president, I'm going to let you get information about the vice president from your textbook, and we're going to spend the rest of this lecture talking about the president himself. So, who is the President of the United States? And when I say that, understand, I'm not asking you who currently holds that particular office. I'm asking you what defines the office itself. And in answering this, I want to look at the word president, right? A president is somebody who presides. To preside is to watch over. And the decision to call our president a president, not a prime minister or a king, but a president, one who presides, was an intentional decision made by the framers at the time that our Constitution was being written. Because you see, originally the president wasn't expected to be tremendously powerful in the domestic arena. Constitutionally speaking, the functions of the president primarily deal with foreign policy and national security. So when it comes to things like negotiating treaties with foreign powers or handling military engagements, the president has always been very powerful. But when it comes to things like domestic policy, law and order, or the economy, the modern power of the president is just that, modern. It's not something that's always been around. I want you to understand that the president today fulfills many different roles in government and has a great deal of power. The President of the United States is well, inarguably the most powerful person in the entire government, if not in the entire world. And I want you to understand that when it comes to the powers of the presidency, there are really two different types of power we can talk about. First, we have the formal powers of the president. These are sometimes called the enumerated, explicit, or delegated powers, but whatever you call them, the formal powers of the president are the formal legal powers of the president, which are expressly written into law in the Constitution or by statutes. Remember from prior lecture, a statute is a law created by Congress as opposed to one created by, say, the Constitution. So the president really has two different types of formal power. He has constitutional powers, which are formal powers explicitly given to the president by the Constitution. And then he has statutory powers, which are formal powers explicitly given to the president not by the Constitution, but through an act of Congress. Examples of statutory powers include the power of the president to issue executive orders and to declare emergencies. You can look at the Constitution if you like. The words executive order and declare emergency don't really appear. And if you've done your reading for this week, you know that. So how is it that the president has the power to declare national emergencies? Well, that power was given to the president by Congress. So it's still a formal power. It's explicitly given to the president, and it requires an actual legal action. But it's not in the Constitution. In addition to these formal powers, the president also has informal powers, which are sometimes called persuasive or persuasion powers, or often inherent powers. The informal powers are the practical or informal powers of a president derived from the resources, prestige, and visibility of the office. So, for instance, the President of the United States has a great deal of influence over politics simply because people pay attention to him when he speaks. Without ever taking any kind of formal or legal action, the president can dramatically change public policy in our country. One way that a president might dramatically change public policy in our country without ever directly taking an official legal action is by publicly speaking to the American people. In the aftermath of 9/11, for example, the United States economy came to a grinding halt because people were too afraid to go to work for fear that they would be the victims of another terror attack. And this was the reality. Until then, President George Bush went on national television and reassured the American people. Now, speaking to the American people, doing an interview, and talking in front of a camera, none of these are official legal actions discussed in the Constitution or by acts of Congress. They don't require any formal legal steps to be taken by the president. He could just sit in front of a camera and start talking. And yet, by doing so, our president at the time, George Bush, was able to sufficiently reassure the American people. And within hours, the entire American economy was back in action. And so simply by speaking, simply because he was president and people pay attention to what the president has to say, George Bush was able to have a great deal of influence over day-to-day realities in our country. Other informal powers of the president involve things like persuading Congress to introduce certain types of law or to not introduce certain types of law, or using the media to communicate and shape the public agenda. Presidents like, well, former President Donald Trump were able to do things like use social media very effectively to shape the types of issues and topics that Americans talk about during campaign season. So again, informal powers don't require any actual legal steps to be taken by the president. These are the powers inherent to being president. And what I want you to understand is that while the president used to be relatively weak, that was because presidents at the beginning of our country's history focused on their formal powers, whereas today presidents rely much more heavily on informal powers. And I want you to understand that while the formal powers of the president are extremely limited and primarily deal with national security or foreign policy, the informal powers of the president are extremely expansive. And over time, they have grown very rapidly. If you look at just the formal powers of the president, he seems to service as what people have historically referred to as the clerk-in-chief. If you don't know, a clerk is basically a secretary. Now, secretaries are very important to the running of an office, or in this case, to the running of a government. But they're not the ones making the big decisions. Those are decisions usually being made by other actors in government. And that's how the president originally operated. Historically, people have not looked to the president as the leader of our country. They have looked to Congress as the leader of our country. And that really isn't true anymore. It, again, like many things involving the president, changed in particular under the administration of FDR, although the trend had actually begun earlier than that. So now that we've talked about the presidential powers, the two major types, how they relate to one another, and how they've changed over time, let's talk a little bit about how presidents use these formal and informal powers to fulfill different roles or functions within our government. It is at this stage that we can begin to discuss that learning objective where I asked you to delineate the major hats of the modern president. And those 5 major hats can be labeled as follows. Number 1, head of state. Number 2, chief executive. Number 3, commander-in-chief. Number 4, chief diplomat. And number 5, chief legislator. So what does it mean to say that the president serves as our head of state? Well, when I tell you that the president serves as head of state, what I'm telling you is that the president provides us with a ceremonial figurehead or symbolic head of government. And this is the least formal and most symbolic function of the president, but it is important to understand that today, when we're looking for a sense of national unity, identity, or leadership, we do in fact have a tendency to turn to the president. And the president can provide us with this sense of direction, national unity, or plan by engaging in public spectacles, by addressing the country, say after a tragedy, or presenting us with a plan through, say, a series of radio addresses called the fireside chats. Right? These are all real examples. Presidents serve as our head of state, as our symbolic figurehead of American national leadership when they participate in cultural events. For instance, in the case of Teddy Roosevelt, you'll see on your slide that every president since Teddy Roosevelt has thrown the first pitch of every Major League Baseball game. Now, throwing that pitch is not taking any kind of formal legal action, right? It doesn't actually count. That would give one team in that game a substantial advantage because the opening pitch of the other team would have been thrown by a politician instead of an actual player. But it is culturally important because baseball is America's pastime. It's our national sport. And so by participating in these kind of cultural events, the president is trying to give us something to rally behind and around, a sense of national identity. Similarly, if we go back to the example I gave with George W. Bush, after 9/11, the American people were terrified. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to act. And so we waited in our houses until the president showed up on our television screens and told us what to do. He said, go back to work. Get on with your lives. Don't let this interrupt you in your daily existence. We will protect you. Here's what you can do to help us. Something similar happened under FDR. Right, under FDR, when he came into office, our country was dealing with a number of huge national issues like the Dust Bowl, World War II, and yeah, that Great Depression. And people wanted to know what they could do to help us overcome these obstacles. So what did FDR do? Well, he used his position as our head of state to address the American people in a series of radio addresses called fireside chats. During these radio addresses, FDR said, hey, I understand things are challenging right now. Here are the steps our government is taking. Here is our plan and course of action, and here is how you can contribute to that. Here are the job opportunities available to you. Here are the programs available to you. Use them in this way and help us move forward as a country. And people really listened to what FDR had to say, just as they would later listen to what George W. Bush had to say in the aftermath of 9/11. So the bottom line here is that the president serves as our head of state anytime he's acting as a symbolic figurehead of government for the American people. And he does this by participating in cultural events or spectacles and by addressing the American public, especially in a time of crisis. You can contrast the president's role as head of state with his role as chief executive by understanding that the head of state is the symbolic figurehead or standing head of government, whereas the chief executive might be thought of as the acting head of government. Chief executive is the role that the president fulfills when he uses his position as the head of the executive branch to administrate our country by enforcing and executing the law. And there are a number of different ways in which a president might go about serving as chief executive, or in other words, there are a number of different ways that a president might administrate the law. First, I want you to understand that the president can act as chief executive anytime he is trying to maintain law and order domestically. And sometimes this does involve dispatching troops. Don't confuse the function of the president as chief executive with the function of president as commander-in-chief. The president wears his third hat, commander-in-chief, when he wields his power as the supreme commander of the United States military forces and National Guards for the purpose of national security, protecting our interests abroad and protecting our sovereignty from foreign aggression. But he serves as chief executive when he, say, issues an executive order dispatching the National Guard to re-establish law and order in our country if you have people in Little Rock, Arkansas refusing to desegregate public schools, or if you have rioters in the street. One of the most controversial tools in the president's toolbox as chief executive is the executive order. However, there's a great deal of misunderstanding about what executive orders do and do not serve to function as and fulfill in our government. So let me clarify a few points. First and foremost, I want you to write this down. Executive orders do not create new laws. I'll say that again. Executive orders do not create new laws. Executive orders are administrative instructions provided by the president to other actors in the executive branch, and in particular in the executive bureaucracy. Executive orders, therefore, fulfill two distinct functions. In other words, there are two different ways that the president can wield an executive order. First, the president can use an executive order to enforce existing laws. This is what Eisenhower did when, acting as chief executive, he dispatched the National Guard to enforce a federal court ruling mandating racial desegregation of public schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. Second, a president can use an executive order to instruct agencies on how to carry out or implement an existing law. Now again, he cannot use the executive order to create a new law, but he can dramatically change how existing laws are being implemented. For instance, former President Bill Clinton issued an executive order called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which instructed agents within the armed forces and other parts of our government on how they should implement a law created by Congress at that time, which prohibited homosexuals from serving in the United States Armed Forces. Under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, the agents were told that they should obey the law and fire any individual who came out as a homosexual in the armed forces. However, the executive order said we are not going to actively pursue investigations into people's sexual orientation. If they publicly declare they're gay, then fire them, but don't go asking them about their sexual orientation until they volunteer that information. This changed how the policy was being carried out, but it didn't rewrite the law altogether or create a new policy ex nihilo. All right, so what else? Other than executive orders, enforcing and administrating the law, how can the president serve as chief executive? Well, other administrative activities that fall within this category involve nominating cabinet members. Remember, these are the 15 heads of the cabinet departments, the 14 secretaries, and the attorney general, or nominating judges and justices to serve on federal courts, such as the Supreme Court. He can also act as chief executive by granting pardons or amnesty, and again, by dispatching troops to maintain law and order in the domestic domain. The third hat, as I've mentioned, is that of commander-in-chief. The president serves as commander-in-chief when he acts as the supreme commander of our military forces, dealing with anything war or national security oriented. I want you to understand that the commander-in-chief function of the president is his most constitutional function. And it is while serving as commander-in-chief that the President of the United States is at his most powerful. One thing that you could and should quickly jot down in your notes is that the president rarely acts alone. For all of the other functions we're going to talk about, the president is going to be dependent upon the participation, consent, and cooperation of other actors in government. But quite frequently, when we're talking about the president as commander-in-chief, you're going to find that he can basically do whatever he wants, because that particular article of the United States Constitution does clearly specify that he is the supreme commander. Now, this can create some confusion because the supreme commander, the president, is allowed to do things like dispatch our troops and keep them in place for however long he likes. But in 1973, the United States Congress passed a new law called the War Powers Act of 1973. And the War Powers Act of 1973 basically told the president that if he were to dispatch troops, he would have 90 days to get Congress to declare war or abandon ship. In other words, he was allowed to act as commander-in-chief by dispatching troops to a foreign country for up to 3 months, for 90 days. But after that period, unless Congress consented to declare war, he would have to bring those troops back. And so now there's a great deal of disagreement about whether the president is able to do things like maintain a military presence in a foreign country. Well, the answer to this controversy is a little more complicated than yes or no, but not much more complicated. Constitutionally, the answer is absolutely yes. The president clearly is granted supreme authority as commander-in-chief in the Constitution, and therefore is allowed to dispatch our troops and doesn't need congressional authorization to do so, even if the deployment lasts for more than 90 days. However, what we're going to find is that technically speaking, the War Powers Act is still a living law within the federal code, within existing statutes. Why? Well, because remember from prior lecture that in order for an act of Congress, which is found to be in violation of the Constitution, to be overturned, it has to be taken to court. And nobody's really bothered to take the War Powers Act to court, and there are two reasons for this reality. Number one, since the War Powers Act, every president has voluntarily complied with that regulation, with one exception, Barack Obama during his engagement in Syria. George Bush, Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan, every single president until Barack Obama voluntarily complied with the War Powers Act. And what that meant was that there was never a case to take to court. Remember, the courts don't hear hypothetical cases. There has to be a justiciable controversy, a case in controversy. And so, it is not until a president actually violates this law that a lawsuit can be brought asking the courts to review whether the law is constitutional or not. So why didn't this lawsuit come to fruition? Why wasn't this reviewed by the courts when Barack Obama violated the War Powers Act? Well, because, remember from past lecture, that we've got this thing called the Supremacy Clause, which says that if there's a conflict between an act of Congress and the Constitution wins. Congress didn't bother trying to take Barack Obama to court because Congress knew that if they did take Barack Obama to court for violating the War Powers Act, then the courts would rule in Obama's favor because the War Powers Act violates the Constitution. So this is an unconstitutional and therefore largely unenforceable law. It creates a lot of confusion, but the bottom line here is that, yeah, as commander-in-chief, the president is the supreme commander of all the armed forces for our country, and when it comes to acting as commander-in-chief, defending our national security from foreign aggressors or dispatching troops to foreign soil, he's got a lot of leeway. Again, remember that if the president is dispatching troops for national security or to a foreign location, he's acting as commander-in-chief. But if he is using an executive order to dispatch troops domestically to maintain law and order, he's acting as chief executive. If he is not using troops to maintain law and order in the domestic sphere, but he is using troops, then he's commander-in-chief. So what about the fourth hat of the president? This is the hat that the president wears when he represents us abroad, and we call it the chief diplomat. Remember that the president serves as the head of state when he provides Americans with a symbolic figurehead of American leadership, while he serves as the chief diplomat when he presents the rest of the world with a figurehead of American government. The president recognizes foreign governments, he makes treaties, he effects executive agreements, he appoints ambassadors who represent us in embassies or in the United Nations, he signs treaties, and he is the one who tells the rest of the world what it can expect from us, as well as what we expect from them. So anytime you see a U.S. president speaking to a foreign people, a foreign country, government, or decision maker, you see the president acting as the chief diplomat. When he represents the United States, its wants, needs, and interests at the negotiation table in intergovernmental organizations like the UN or World Trade Organization, when he has meetings with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu or with the King of Saudi Arabia, he is acting as the chief diplomat. And the president is quite powerful as chief diplomat. Now, he's not quite as powerful while acting as chief diplomat as when acting as commander-in-chief. But this is where he is at his second most powerful, because remember, most of the formal powers of the president involve either war and national security or foreign relations. And diplomacy is foreign relations. However, the president doesn't get to do whatever he wants. For instance, if he wants to enter into a treaty with a foreign country, that treaty has to be ratified by the United States Senate before it is enforced as law. Now, some presidents, since especially Bill Clinton, have been able to get around this using what we call executive agreements, which are basically agreements between the president and a foreign leader rather than technically agreements between the United States and a foreign country. NAFTA and other trade agreements like the TPP are the best examples of this. You don't really need to know too much about executive agreements for the purposes of this lecture, but I will tell you these are extremely controversial, and many people believe that they are unconstitutional because they allow the president to effectuate the practical realities of a treaty without getting the constitutionally mandated senatorial approval. All right, the fifth and final hat of the modern president is that of chief legislator. The President of the United States serves as chief legislator anytime he uses the formal or informal powers of his office to influence how Congress legislates, or, in other words, anytime he is influencing the lawmaking process. Remember from prior lecture that, formally speaking, the President does not have the power to introduce a new law for consideration into Congress. A House representative can introduce a new proposed policy to the House, whereas a senator can introduce a new proposed law to the Senate, but the president is neither a representative nor a senator, and therefore cannot introduce new laws. Informally, however, if a president has a policy that he, or maybe one day she, would like to be considered, then this president probably won't have very much difficulty finding at least one House representative or one senator to introduce that policy on his, or maybe one day her, behalf. So that's an informal way in which the president can influence the legislator. He can influence the legislator informally by agenda setting. Now, agenda setting is basically when the president tells Congress what types of policies he would like them to consider, what sorts of issues he would like them to tackle, and what sorts of solutions he would like them to propose. For instance, when a president provides his State of the Union address, which, by the way, is called for in the Constitution, he's technically speaking to Congress. The State of the Union is to update Congress on the major issues facing our country and the types of solutions that the president would like Congress to propose in addressing those problems. The ones that he, based on the expert testimony of his advisors, believes are the most likely to be successful. When Donald Trump gave his State of the Union address to Congress after getting elected, you will find that he talked a great deal about immigration. He was setting the agenda. He was telling Congress, hey, immigration is a major issue in our country that we need to address. We've got a problem and reform is required. And then he went on to say, hey, when you're coming up with solutions to this problem, this need for immigration reform, be sure that at a minimum you include the authorization of federal funds for the purpose of constructing a wall along the border with Mexico to promote better security. And guess what? There were several different bills written and formally introduced by many different members of both chambers of Congress dealing with the wall. And hey, guess what? That dominated a great deal of discussion during his entire 4 years of office. Now, in the case of Donald Trump, the wall was never built. Portions of the wall were put into place, but he was unable to get Congress to fully authorize the construction of his wall. And there's not all that much he can do about that, because formally, the powers of the president over the legislative process are quite limited. He can veto laws that he doesn't like, and he can call special sessions of Congress if he thinks that there is an emergency which requires Congress's immediate attention. But he cannot force Congress to pass a law if they do not want to, at least not formally speaking. So what are the tools that presidents have to get Congress to comply with their proposed policies if Congress is being resilient or resistant? Well, broadly speaking, presidents have two informal approaches to encouraging Congress to sign policies consistent with the president's agenda. These are called bargaining and going public. Bargaining is when a president has a private meeting with key members of Congress and negotiates in order to get Congress to agree to pass his policies or fund his initiatives. And Donald Trump did try bargaining. He went to Congress and he said, hey, if you will authorize funds for the border wall, then in exchange, I will agree to allow the Democrat program, the Dreamers Act, signed under my predecessor, Barack Obama, to stay in effect. I will not go after that with any executive orders. And the Democrats, who controlled the certain portions of Congress at that time, they refused. So bargaining doesn't always work. And bargaining, is also worth noting, has some drawbacks. Because when Donald Trump promised not to touch the Dreamer Act, he offended a lot of his core supporters, who were adamant opposers of the Dreamer Act. Bargaining can be risky, because if a president relies too heavily on bargaining, he has to make a great deal of compromises. He has to negotiate, and that requires give and take. And it turns out that the core supporters of political figures get a little irritated when their leaders compromise on the things that they care about. So when bargaining fails, or when a president determines that it's a bad idea based on future elections, then the alternative is what we call going public. Going public is a more recent approach, and it basically involves a president speaking directly to the American people. Going public is when the president speaks directly to the American people and mobilizes the public to put pressure on Congress to get Congress to comply with his wishes when bargaining has failed or doesn't seem to be an option. Donald Trump also tried going public. He spoke directly to the American people in a series of televised interviews, and he said, hey, please call your senators, please write your legislators and tell them that if they don't fund the border wall, then you won't vote for them. And some people did. Unfortunately for Donald Trump, he wasn't a particularly popular president, and therefore going public wasn't an especially effective strategy for him. So perhaps a better example of going public comes from Barack Obama. Because when Barack Obama originally ran for office in 2008, he did so primarily on a platform of promises which stated that if elected, Barack Obama would get Congress to pass sweeping healthcare reform. And of course, we know that eventually that's exactly what he did with the Affordable Care Act, or ACA, or as some of you might know it, Obamacare. Now, Barack Obama tried bargaining, but many members of his own party, which had control of both chambers of Congress, were very hesitant to pass the Affordable Care Act, because this was a very large, very complicated, and very comprehensive piece of legislation. And they weren't sure whether or not it would work. They hadn't had time to adequately read, much less study and consider it. And so he wasn't able to get them to agree to sign the Affordable Care Act in a timely manner. And he was afraid that if they didn't act quickly enough, then there would be a midterm election in 2010, and Republicans would be able to take control of one or both chambers of Congress, and at that point it would be effectively impossible for Barack Obama, a Democrat, to get his policies passed through both chambers. So because he was not satisfied with the rate at which Congress was acting on the Affordable Care Act, he went public. He went directly to the American people in a series of televised addresses, and he said, hey, you remember how I campaigned on promises to bring sweeping healthcare reform, and y'all elected me because you liked those promises? Well, now Congress is getting in the way, so please contact your senators and your representatives and tell them that if they don't get on board and vote for this act right now, you won't vote for them in the next midterm election of 2010. And because at this time Barack Obama was extremely popular, many people answered his call to arms, and they were able to force Congress to act on his behalf. But after the Affordable Care Act, what happened with Obama's presidency? Well, he became almost immediately less effective. Why? Well, because by going public, he was able to force Congress to do what he wanted. But that alienated Congress. It made Congress very mad. And so for the rest of his presidency, Barack Obama had to grapple with an alienated Congress that was not feeling very cooperative. And that was an especially big problem for him because even though he was quite popular in the first 2, 3, maybe even 4 years of his presidency, after that his popularity began to rapidly decline and became somewhat lower than average. And this brings us to our next major topic, the final topic that we need to talk about in this lecture. Presidents can only effectively act as a chief legislator when they are popular. The imperative of a president to maintain popularity is what we call the presidential imperative. And the presidential imperative is important for a number of reasons. I want you to write down somewhere in your notes that the number one most important factor explaining why some presidents are effective and others are not is popularity. More popular presidents tend to be more powerful. Less popular presidents tend to be less powerful. And when a president is more popular, he is better able to do things like pressure Congress into complying with his wishes. Think about, for instance, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was one of the most successful and effective presidents in our nation's history. Now, you might disagree with the agenda he pushed, but he did push it very successfully. And a big part of why is that he was extremely important in terms of his popularity with the American people. Ronald Reagan had to deal with a Democrat-controlled Congress throughout his presidency, and yet was still effective. Because even though he had a very, very inimical party in control of the legislative branch, he was able to go public and force them to comply with his wishes more often than not, simply by talking to the American voters who loved him even as Congress hated his guts. And so, we understand that presidents want to be popular in part so that they can be effective. In addition to this, it's important to understand that presidents know that if they are not popular, they won't win re-election. And even if they're a lame duck, i.e. in their second term and not eligible to run for a third term, then they still need to maintain popularity because of what we call the presidential coattails. The presidential coattails phenomenon is basically a phenomenon where, when a president is popular, his party does well in congressional elections and other elections around the country. When he is unpopular, his party does poorly. Presidents want to leave legacies, and they don't want to be replaced by a member of the other party or a Congress of the other party that will then dismantle their policies. Barack Obama, for instance, was very popular at the beginning of his presidency, but not so much at the end of his presidency. And as a result, he was replaced not by a Democrat who could expand upon the Affordable Care Act and his other accomplishments, but by a Republican, Donald Trump, who also had a Republican-controlled Congress, because Barack Obama's lack of popularity meant that Democrats did poorly in Senate and House elections. So Republicans took control of both chambers of Congress and the White House. And what did they do? They began dismantling important parts of the Affordable Care Act, rendering it largely ineffective. So presidents, for these reasons, need to maintain popularity. It is also important to understand that while the powers of a president are subject to certain checks and balances, the likelihood that these will be utilized effectively depends on the presidential imperative, the popularity of that president. So, for instance, the legislator can check the powers of a president by first impeaching that president, in the House by a simple majority vote, and then convicting that president in the Senate with a 2/3 majority vote in order to remove the president from office. Now, I do want to clarify something. To impeach a president and to remove a president from office are not the same thing. Impeachment requires a simple majority vote of the United States House of Representatives. And to impeach a president is simply to formally charge that president with a high crime or misdemeanor. And what we're going to find is that just like anyone else in our country, if the president is formally charged with a crime, he gets a trial. That trial takes place in the Senate. And it is only when 2/3 of the Senate finds the president guilty as charged in the articles of impeachment, ratified by a simple majority vote in the House, that the president will be removed from office. 3 different presidents have been impeached in the history of our country, but at no point have they ever actually been convicted and removed from office. So impeachment and subsequent conviction is a nuclear option that Congress can use to remove a president from office. But it's never actually been utilized. Why? Well, because usually they don't have sufficient popular support to get away with removing a president from office and still staying in power. There is one exception. Richard Nixon probably would have been convicted, because after the Watergate scandal, his approval ratings among voters was so low that Congress felt sufficiently emboldened not only to impeach, but to remove him from office. But he resigned before they could get him. More frequently, the United States Legislator is going to check the president not by using the nuclear option of impeachment and conviction, but by refusing to fund his policies, or in some cases overriding his vetoes. Overriding a veto is very rare. It requires a 2/3 majority of both chambers, and so it doesn't happen too frequently, but it can occur. It happened, for instance, under Barack Obama when he vetoed an act of Congress which basically allowed U.S. citizens affected by 9/11 to sue Saudi Arabia, the foreign country which funded that operation. But most presidents won't veto an act of Congress if they know that Congress has the numbers to override that veto. So again, this is quite rare. But if you look at, for instance, Donald Trump, he was successfully checked by the legislator. Donald Trump wanted to build a border wall, but the legislator prevented him from doing so by refusing to fund that operation. So by refusing to fund a president's operations, Congress can keep him from being able to effectively address the problems that he wants to address and implement the agenda that he wants to implement. The president can fight back by going public and mobilizing the people, but that only works if he's popular. Then we've got the judicial branch. Well, the judicial branch has the power to rule the president's actions, executive orders, and so forth, unconstitutional, which is an effective check. But it is important to understand that presidents are the ones who control the military, not the judicial branch. So the judicial branch doesn't have the power to enforce its own decisions. Not technically. On paper, it shouldn't need it, but in practice, if the judicial branch makes a ruling, it is the executive branch's job to enforce that. So if the judicial branch rules against the executive branch, it counts on the executive branch to self-regulate. And 9 times out of 10, that's what happens. 99 times out of 100. But there's at least one exception in our nation's history when that's not the way things actually worked out. Now, legally, that's how they should work out. But under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Indian removal was unconstitutional. And yet, the Indian removal happened because Andrew Jackson wanted it to happen, and he refused to acknowledge or enforce the Supreme Court's decision. This, again, is quite rare. Andrew Jackson was able to get away with it because that was the first really popularly elected president due to changing electoral laws, and so he had huge amounts of public support. But modern presidents can't really get away with that without being called a tyrant, and because they, again, care about the presidential imperative, they don't want people to think of them as tyrants. Therefore, a more common way for presidents to fight back against the judicial branch is to attempt what is called court packing. Court packing is when presidents use their power as chief executive to nominate justices for the Supreme Court, to select individuals who will basically operate as their puppets and rule in whatever way they see fit. Now, currently there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. But what we're going to find is that that number is not required by the Constitution. It is defined by acts of Congress. And so prior presidents like FDR have been able to use their popularity to encourage Congress to introduce policies to increase the total number of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, and thereby get the Supreme Court to back down by threatening to increase the number of seats through an act of Congress, then fill those seats with appointed puppets who will subvert the independence of the judicial branch to the president's agenda. Now, FDR didn't actually have to pack the court. He had so much popularity that when he proposed court packing as a way to get the court to stop ruling against his New Deal programs, the court backed down. They knew that he had enough support to get that act through Congress. They didn't want to lose their independence, and so they started ruling in his favor, even though his policies weren't really all that different. So court packing is a way that the president can fight back. But again, that depends on popularity. We've recently seen the current president, Joe Biden, attempting to do the exact same thing. He has proposed packing the court because under the presidency of Donald J. Trump, Republicans were able to nominate 3 separate justices, including a replacement for the most liberal justice on the court at the time, Ginsburg, and now the Republicans have a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. Joe Biden and his party are concerned that they might use this majority to do things like rule in favor of increased regulations on abortion, and therefore they've attempted to introduce legislation allowing them to increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court so that they can add on more pro-abortion or pro-choice justices. But they haven't been successful. Why? Well, because the current president isn't FDR. He doesn't have that same degree of public support, and therefore he's not likely to get it through Congress, and therefore the Supreme Court isn't particularly intimidated. So the bottom line here is that presidents aren't comic book villains. They're not all powerful and omnipotent. Their power is highly dependent upon public approval. And when they don't have public approval, they are very easy for the other branches to pick on, check, and limit. And when that happens, they become ineffective. So that's the first half of our lecture on the executive branch and democracy.